In an effort to prove how non-racist they are, some people work very hard to protect the very race they seek to absolve. In their recollection, 60 years is enough time for the black people to become the racists that whites have never been. The same whites who are the majority in every state legislature, the federal legislature, roughly every police force, every government agency, are now the alleged victims of a society that supposedly hates whiteness. But those same people cannot be convinced that black people still endure the remnants of the treachery of white ancestors. And in their attempts to continue hiding the legacy of those white ancestors, work on legislation that upholds their ability to tell the story in a way that continues to ignore what white people did and protect themselves from being held accountable for the very tactics they continue to exploit. Our word of the day is irony. Because as much as they want us to believe they are protecting feelings, they don't want it to be revealed that they are actually protecting themselves from the inevitability that their children will face. Unfortunately, there's nothing amusing about their contradictions. People will use more energy and effort to relive yesterday than to prepare for tomorrow. No matter how much time you spend trying to relive yesterday, tomorrow will come and you will not be prepared for it. All of life, most of nature, centers around what happens tomorrow. The species with allegedly the most sentience always works harder to preserve what used to be, likely with the understanding that it will prolong their life and ability to maintain power. Their goal? To sacrifice the young to save the old. In the state of Mississippi, black lawmakers walked off the floor of the legislature, unable to prevent the state lawmaking body from advancing a bill that will make white people feel comfortable in the education they teach our children. Surprise, surprise, that a white majority will do something that pisses black people off, but I digress. The state of Florida also advancing a bill that protects how history is taught to make white children feel about their race. Most of these lawmakers are the product of indoctrination as implemented by the Daughters of the Confederacy. They are continuing the legacy of their mothers, grandmothers, and a myriad of relatives who have convinced them they should be proud of the history of enslaving black people. In the words of the Daughters of the Confederacy, they want to tell a history that is skewed fair to the Confederate cause of the Civil War, but no side, Union or Confederate, appears to maintain too much interest in telling the side that venerates black people of the society that we live in, a society that hates to be told that it has been built to uphold whiteness. Now, I must remind you what the Constitution of the Confederacy states about who should be enslaved: the African race. And if you need more clarity on what African race means, you probably should not chime in with an opinion on this topic. But because our society allows even idiots to speak with an air of respectability, too many have decided that words are more important than facts. A quote from John Paul Sartre, the 1946 treatise Anti-Semite and Jew. They know that their remarks are frivolous and open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves. For it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. This battle against critical race theory is intimidation, just as with any Confederate statue placed in any town square or prominent street corner. A bunch of white people who are mad that black people have been smart enough to do research that reveals how misinformed those white people want all of us to be. The unfortunate part of the debate on critical race theory is that the people who claim to be experts on CRT are quite often upholding the misinformation as taught to them by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and using their lessons from the veneration of the Confederacy to discredit any attempts to dismantle the lies they tell themselves and others about the legacy of the Confederacy. Now, as stated, they know they are acting in bad faith. They know they have no sound argument, but they pursue the battle against accuracy nonetheless. Most of this recent debate on critical race theory was inspired by one man, Christopher Rufo. Not to dive too deep into his personal life, but he is married to a woman of Asian descent, which in effect means his life work is to make sure that his children never find out what his people did to their mother's people. He wants his children to be raised under the belief that they will be attacked for their whiteness, so they can ignore how historically they have been attacked for being Asian. And his wife co-signs his efforts. To the words that he actually said March 15th, 2021. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. Let me correct that just a bit. Unpopular with white Americans, as they have stormed school board meetings and voted to be sure that it is not taught in their schools, which it is actually a graduate level course, meaning post-secondary education. But because a white man has said it is in other places, they automatically follow like lemmings off a cliff. We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. Be careful whose narrative you champion, especially when they are so bold with revealing their treachery. Let's be very clear. Look at the demographics of the people telling you that CRT harms. White males who do not want people to know what white males have done, are doing, and will continue to do as long as we allow them to tell us how to write and teach the narrative. Decades of work by black scholars can be undone in a single year by one white man's ire. It may not be racist, it surely is odd. Rufo actually works with the Manhattan Institute, a think tank that states in its mission to develop and disseminate new ideas that foster greater economic choice and individual responsibility. On a related note, isn't accurately telling history one of the main ways you can, quote, foster greater economic choice and individual responsibility? Who should be individually held responsible for lying to the children or passing legislation that ensures they remain misled and deceived? More than 20 states work on legislation that limits critical race theory being taught in school, Pennsylvania included, which we will address at a later date. In Maryland, a slightly different approach presented by Delegate C.T. Wilson to the Maryland Ways and Means House Committee. House Bill 47, Public Schools Expanded American History, Development of Content Standards and Implementation. Quote, the content standards for expanded American history shall include instruction on the history and contributions of the following groups: African Americans, American Indians, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, Hispanic Americans, women, and other groups as determined by the state board. Each county, in collaboration with the local school system, shall develop and implement age-appropriate curriculum guides for expanded American history subject to the content standards established under subsection A of this section, beginning 2023-2024 school year. In the early stages of this legislation, not many details. C.T. Wilson, a member of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, is a graduate of Howard University School of Law, in case you were wondering. He represents Charles County. I encourage you to keep an eye on this bill. Any pushback it receives might be key in a time where conservatives work hard to restrict access and information to children. The term age appropriate raises my eyebrow just a bit because that is a term that justifies the fears of a white populace that does not want their children to know how grandma really felt about those people. Remember, in the state of Texas, a lawmaker had a list of 800 books that needed to be banned. His tactic mirrored across the country. On a side note, conservatives condemn removing statues as rewriting history and removing books as upholding history. You figure it out. The same conservatives that claim leftists and liberals are Nazis find themselves removing books and banning education they deem inappropriate, just like the Nazis did. Kind of makes you wonder who's telling the truth about opposing Nazis, especially since Adolf Hitler learned his tactics from watching how the South treated black people during the Jim Crow era, which continued more than 20 years post-World War II, just so we are clear on our timelines. It began in the 1800s and ended in the 1960s, whereas the laws in Germany lasted during the 1930s and 40s. Remember, black soldiers helped fight the war overseas and had to return to a segregated USA. The military did not integrate until the Second World War had already ended. Earlier this year, we learned that it was possibly a Jewish man trying to save his own family who betrayed the Frank family, sending Anne and her family to a concentration camp in 1940s Germany. The information regarding this incident is still under debate at this time, since it does not favor the Jewish cause to reveal that a Jewish person may have sent Jews to the ovens. But if you know your history in this country, black people often betrayed slaves, civil rights activists, and now currently condemn critical race theory, in keeping with the tradition of betraying their race to save their own behind. So the story should come as no surprise to any black person in this country. Nat Turner was discovered by slaves who reported his hiding spot to the local farmer that eventually captured him at gunpoint. Your Second Amendment at work. If you have ever read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a jail in Birmingham, you know it was written to chastise black people who were telling him to tone it down. Project 21, a black leadership network, praises defunding critical race theory, claiming the teaching of the facts of history is divisive. These are black leaders who don't want people to learn the history of how black people overcame and continue to overcome the policies, laws, and procedures put in place to hinder our success. They released a statement claiming that critical race theory harms the legacy of Dr. King, who wanted peace and unity. You cannot have peace and unity without truth and accountability. Remember, the main reason we continue to battle these truths is because the defenders of the Confederacy never wanted peace. They surrendered, but remained dormant until they could politically overpower abolition. And as we have learned in this series, sought to reframe the Civil War and what Confederates wanted to keep. Remember, there have only been 2 black real daughters of the Confederacy. All other members were white or white presenting. White presenting because Irish, Italian, Scottish, Jewish, Gentile, or any other demographic that could prove they are a descendant of those soldiers were allowed to be deemed real descendants. The Confederacy did not allow black soldiers until 1 month before their surrender out of desperation. And yes, some slaves volunteered. Some blacks volunteered to keep enslavement a right. So people who are involved in and support initiatives such as Project 21 are in a sense upholding black history, happy February, by constantly reminding us that betrayal and denial are the only ways some people want to be free. Once again, this is not a religious show, but the word surely says the truth shall set you free. Black people fighting harder to maintain our enslavement than our collective emancipation, assimilation is their idea of freedom. It is a form of protection, because if the master can see them working harder to defend massa than the slaves, massa won't harm me in the same way he will harm them. Project 21 is not the only such organization, just the one I am focusing on today. Now let's be fair to Dr. King's legacy. The content of your character, not the color of your skin. This is the only phrase too many naysayers of critical race theory love to pull from their rectum without at least wiping the fecal matter from it. The content of your character is that you prefer propaganda instead of history. You prefer absolution instead of truth. You prefer indoctrinating children instead of letting them know how the past formed the present. Your hope is that their lack of knowledge will advance us all. A relationship built on deception and lies deserves to fail. This country will not meet its demise because white people are guilty. This country will meet its demise because some white people decided that all white people should venerate the Confederacy and have passed that desire to deceive on every other race in this country to make sure that the Confederacy is never held responsible for what they were able to do and wanted to do to black people. That is the content of the character. The content of the character of the Confederacy was enslaving people of the African race. Their words in their Constitution. The only farce of critical race theory is that it is not a theory. It is fact. It is mighty coincidental that black people cannot convince whites of the harm their policies do to black people, but whites can convince the nation that they are harmed by teaching facts. They commit the very thing critical race theory says they are doing, while claiming it misrepresents what white people have put in policy. A look at the critical race theory laws in Florida and Texas next time, Off the Top.